So really where I'd like to start, Dylan, because obviously the Future Laboratory very much came out of a journalism practice or an ethic. Both Martin and I obviously worked as journalists prior to setting up the Future Laboratory. I indeed was a freelancer for GQ over a few years. And Martin had a focus in broadcast journalism, and it was a magazine that brought us together. We both worked on a publication called Viewpoint, which had the mission to think and act with the mind of the consumer and to offer up a view of the future that would influence the sales and marketing strategy of tomorrow. And it was through doing that magazine and through looking at how lifestyle was changing in the late 90s and the impact that the notion of changing lifestyle that was coming up through the street was having across lifestyle industries, that meant that we started, when we were working on this magazine, we started to get people calling, kind of saying, we love your magazine. Do you know an agency that has the same kind of philosophy, that can think about trend or the future in the same kind of way? And after about the third of doing that, of kind of going, no, don't know anyone, we kind of went, well, there's an opportunity here, which was why we set the Future Laboratory up. But you've been involved in the world of media communications for, as far as I'm aware, the best part of your entire career, and have spent many, many years now at the helm of one of the most influential style and men's interest magazines that there's ever been. And as a result of that, have been instrumental, I think, in changing the way that men think about both themselves, but also the way that they engage with content and the way that they think about engaging with lifestyle content. And I'd like to kick off by asking you really about how you think the world of media communications has really changed over the last 20 years, which is a fairly big question. But if you think back to the year 2000 and think about what you were doing then and where the magazine world was then, what are some of the changes that for you were the most pertinent?
The most pertinent change is delivery systems. The way that we got to market 20 years ago is it's like a different world, like a completely different world. The internet, it wasn't in its infancy, but it wasn't a particularly sophisticated experience, and it wasn't acknowledged as being the direct route to market that it is now. People didn't have mobile telephones in the way that they do now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know all this. However, and my big however, comma, is that I think we're living in an incredibly exciting time, particularly if you can pivot in the way that you need to pivot. And I have local conversations in my office. I have national conversations, international conversations on Zoom calls, and up until 6 months ago in all parts of the world, about wrestling with this nature of how media tackles not just the future but the present. But I think it's very simple. I think that it's all about. It's about two things. It's about three things. It's about having a very clear idea of who you are as a brand and who your customer is. It's an obsession with quality, and it's also drilling down into the most pertinent, successful, and efficient way to connect with your customer. And actually, I think in a very base level, if you're talking about print in a world of digital, just look at the success that the New York Times has had. Yeah. Mark Thompson has had an incredibly successful period there, turning that product into a subscription model. And that is one model which I think lots of people will adopt. Lots of people should have adopted already. If you take a brand like ours, we have three buckets. We have a print business, which, even considering the challenges of the last 7 months, is still a considerable business, and I think if you were trading well going into this period, you'll be trading when we come trading well when we come out of it. And I've got no concerns about that at all. As I was saying earlier, we just had in September our biggest month for traffic ever, 4.9 million. Plus, we have a hugely successful event business, and I know lots of people have tried to pivot into events, but we've been in events for 20 years.
Yeah.
I don't say that conceitedly. I mean, we just have. Initially as a marketing play, but recently it's become a very important part of our commercial business.
Yeah.
But I really do think that we have returned to a time where there is a reappreciation of expertise. And we've been through acres and acres and acres and almost decades now of fake news, of stuff, of content, of just piles and piles of unmitigated material which has been photocopied and abused and edited, etc., etc., etc. I honestly think that people want, appreciate, and will pay for really good content. I was having this discussion yesterday with someone who was disagreeing with me. I said, well, even people who are 14 and 15 get their news from somewhere. That's mediated in it's all mediated. And there will be a way to make that person pay for what they're consuming. And it's all about monetizing your offer. But we're getting a lot better at that. We're far more sophisticated at that than we used to be. And the industry as a whole is far more sophisticated. And I think that when people go out of business, and it's always a tragedy when journalistic operations go out of business, it's usually a combination of two things. It's the fact that the consumer doesn't want what they're offering anymore, and they haven't been, the brand hasn't been as adept or as swift as it needed to be in terms of finding a route to market.
Yeah.
That's it. It's no more complicated than that. Solving it is complicated, but identifying the problem isn't complicated. Yeah. And because of that, I see a bright, shiny future for what we do. We've just got to be very smart about it.
It's interesting, isn't it? You know, and for you, having the title editor throughout a period where it's been about these highs and lows of the value that is given to an editorial perspective and an editorial eye, I think is increasingly interesting. And within the retail kind of strand of a conversation like this, when I was speaking to Linda Hewson from Selfridges, and we were talking about the role of the department store, and she was asking me about the future of the department store. And for me, you know, a great department store is like a great magazine. It's editorial, it's curated and edited content, which means that, you know, some of the pain of choice is taken away from you as a consumer, because you place your hands in, you place your trust in the hands of those who you feel are actually going to make the right decisions for you. That you don't want to have to scroll through endless amounts of content to find something valuable. That job's being done for you. That you know, and that goes back to that issue of quality, which I think is so important. I'm interested in that relationship between brand and media, because obviously that's been one of the engines of growth for digital over the last 15 years, and the way in which obviously we now see a whole new market for influencers and brand ambassadors that has started to grow up, but really still centers around that energy, or the friction, the tension that exists between brand and media platform. And I'm wondering if you've had any chance to think about how you see that evolving. You come from a background that is quite traditional in terms of the idea that often this is seen as a church and state kind of conversation, where the two are always kept at arm's length and they're not allowed to necessarily commingle too much, because we always talk about, you know, the sanctity of the editorial voice or the editorial position. And of course, what we've seen online is the complete reversal of that. And I'm just wondering how you think some of those difficult tensions might evolve as we move through the next decade.
I don't think there is a tension there at all. I think it's all to do with integrity. And we've always run it as a business where we are successful and we thrive because we are a business. But I don't think that having a strong commercial seam or a film to your business is in any way hampering to editorial integrity. I think that where influencers have started to become less influential than they were is because everyone knows that it's completely transactional. And I think if you are a genuine influencer or a person of influence who espouses things which people find particularly interesting, or they dress in a particular way, or they interconnect with our worlds in interesting ways and create, that's fascinating, and there's room for everyone. But I think the whole nature of influencers on Instagram has become pretty puerile, and it doesn't work as well as it used to because it is completely transactional. We work with brands that dovetail with our brands, and brands work with us for exactly the same reason, because they like our attitude, they like our modus operandi, and they like our constituency. At a very, very base level, years ago, and I'm talking decades ago, I'd become the editor of Arena magazine, which in the 80s was a very important men's magazine, the first men's magazine in the sort of latest iteration of men's magazines. And my first issue coincided with Christmas, and that was a time when I still went home to see my parents at Christmas. My brother was there. My brother's in the Air Force, and we have two very different worlds. We live two different lives, although we're not estranged at all. We like each other enormously. And he said, "What are you working on at the moment?" And I said, "Oh, I'm doing this." And I showed him the magazine. And I tell advertisers this right to this day, because I think it's a very telling observation about how people consume with media, and why media should not be compromised by advertising or commercial imperatives. You basically pick the magazine up and flick through it and said, "Oh, I've seen that car. Oh, I've bought that stereo. Oh, I'm thinking of going there, etc., 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 etc." And my point is, if you pick up a copy of a glossy magazine, like a fashion magazine, like Bazaar or Vogue, if you take all the ads out of it, people feel disappointed. They feel shortchanged. It's a whole package. And that harmony, that editorial commercial harmony, is as strong now as it's ever been. And I just think it becomes more sophisticated. I think the only problem is when you're trying to disguise something which isn't true, or you're trying to elevate a brand when it shouldn't be elevated, or you're working with people who you shouldn't work with. And I've always said, if you look at the world of content right now, and sort of content plays and brand partnerships, all it really is a glorified version of advertorial. And advertorial used to be that world where you would work if you weren't good enough to work in editorial and you weren't good enough to work in commercial. So you were the promo department, you were the advertorial department, and consequently what you ended up with wasn't very good. These days you've got to be better than everybody. Yeah. And those plays are really important. So much of what we do is done in conjunction and in partnership with big brands. And consequently we create great editorial. For the last 4 years, we've produced a lot of short films for Gucci. They sit on all our platforms globally and all Gucci's platforms globally. And because the budgets are so high, it enables our creative teams to work with great people in front of and behind the camera. And we produce content, films, that are perhaps better than any other kind of promo, co-branded content that we've ever done before. But it is editorial.
Yeah. Just one more question before maybe I throw it over to you to ask me something. But how do you think your consumer has changed over the last 20 years? And where can you see, is there a trajectory where you think your reader is moving in terms of the way that they both engage with content, but also what it is that they're after?
It's changed in two ways. I think the first way is that there are far more ways for someone to enter a brand now. And the flip side of that is that we have far more opportunities to connect with people because of the different platforms, because of all the social platforms, because of digital, because of events, as well as our sort of runway brand, which is the magazine. And secondly, I think that, I've always looked at our consumer as someone that will keep forever. And if you talk to the commercial department, they'll say, well, he is 24 to 38, he's AB1, he's urban, he's this, he's that. That's fine. And in terms of consumption, they're probably right. But I've always said, if it's like a newspaper, if you can catch someone at 16, if you're a Times reader at 16, you'll probably be a Times reader until you die.
Yeah.
And that's what I want. And for some of our readers, they are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. However, unless I can keep getting the 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, then I'm dead and the brand is dead.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's got to be that element of how you think about what it is and anticipate what it is that next consumer is going to want. And understand.
Yeah, but also, if you take an example like you take any day on our website, or indeed take something like the September issue, where I know there will be things in there that will appeal to men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah. But
there will also be things in there that will appeal to men in their late teens and early 20s, and that has to be the case. Every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Was there something you wanted to ask me?
When I was first asked to be involved, I'm very flattered to be involved in your anniversary. One question came to mind, and it's a question which is a genuine question. I would like to know, of all you're very good at kind of subsets and saying, it's all about X and it's all about Y. And in the future, it's all going to be about people who are wearing this, who are doing this, these hyphenates that you come up with and these clever little groupings, some of which I believe. I'd like to know, of all the market research that you've done the last couple of decades, that of all the people and the sectors and the ideas and the things that you've identified very, very cleverly, which one is most appropriate for now going forward? Which is when you think, God, we were right about that.
That's hands down. It's an easy one because it's still so front and center for us. Is that we came up with and coined the term phygital to describe the connection between the physical and the digital environment, especially within the context of retail. And we were trying, this was at a point where retail businesses, especially within clothing, for example, would have whole teams that would be dedicated to online business and online marketing. And they would sit in a completely different department from the rest of traditional marketing. And there was this separation and segregation of what digital was. And it was only later that we started to have all this new language around the idea of omnichannel and all these kind of other strands that were obsessing teams within organizations. And when we came up with the term phygital to define this idea of what needs to happen and the coexistence of the physical and the digital environment, it was to try and help businesses to understand that this wasn't about putting a natty iPad in the corner for their consumer to play with when they walked into a store, but it was about how they created a depth of content and a depth of engagement that coexisted before you even got into a store, while you were on your mobile phone, while you were at the bus stop or in your car waiting for the lights to change. But it enabled you to create a much more profound relationship between consumer and brand that then took you through into a store or took you into the point of purchase or when the package arrives to your door at home, whatever it might be. And I mean, apart from the fact now I just hear that word incessantly when I speak to clients and when I look around me, I just think we absolutely got that one bang on in terms of preempting and being there ahead of the curve on that understanding of the role that these two often entirely disparate elements of successful business needed to play by coming together, and actually thinking about when they play together and when they work together, they create a much more meaningful engagement for the consumer. And I think that's what's been so interesting about that as a particular trend or journey.
Thank you.
So yeah, that would be my answer. I'm very aware of the clock.
Okay.
Thank you, Dylan, so much for your time.
Pleasure.
I really do appreciate it. We'd love to see you live if you're around next week, 5 o'clock. And an invitation is on its way if it hasn't arrived to you already. They all went out in the post yesterday, so hopefully we've still got some posties who are delivering around town. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Lovely to see you, and hopefully see you next week.
I hope so. Thanks.
Take care. Bye.